He was just an exhausted single dad fixing lights at 2 a.m. in a house he thought was empty. But when the door creaked open and a barefoot woman whispered, "Stay until it's over," he stepped into a night that would change everything. Before we begin this unforgettable story of two strangers, each carrying silent burdens, finding light in the most unexpected place. If you love heartfelt stories that restore your faith in kindness and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now, let's begin. Single Dad was fixing lights at 2 a.m., but the heiress in bare feet said, "Stay until it's over." The call came through at 1:46 a.m. Gabe Keller was already halfway through the warehouse district windshield wipers slapping back and forth in rhythm with the rain when the job pinged on his work phone. Emergency light failure circuit overload suspected. Residence 1128 Willow Creek Drive. He squinted. Willow Creek. That wasn't warehouse territory. That was gated manicured and definitely out of his usual rotation. But the system had flagged it urgent, and urgent paid overtime. He glanced at the baby monitor app on his cracked phone. Emmy was sound asleep at home, tucked in safe under the care of her teenage babysitter, Maddie. "All right," Gabe muttered to himself, changing lanes. One more job. By 2:05 a.m. he was pulling up outside a 3-story colonial mansion that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread titled "Old Money, New Silence." The gates were already open. The security lights flickered oddly along the stone pathway, evidence of the electrical issue. No barking dogs, no signs of life. He rang the doorbell. No answer. Gabe hesitated. This wasn't the kind of house you entered without permission. But the service request had come directly through the central system with GPS coordinates and ID verification. Someone inside had triggered the emergency protocol. He rang again. Still nothing. Then he noticed the door. It wasn't latched properly. A faint gap. The kind of thing that happens when someone forgets to pull it shut all the way. He stepped back, weighing the risk. But the rain was coming down harder, and the front lights buzzed overhead like dying fireflies. He pulled out his badge, recording a time-stamped voice note. Arrived on site, no response, front door unsecured. Entering to assess. The inside was quiet, cavernous. Smelled like antique wood and lemon oil. He wiped his boots at the door out of habit. The foyer stretched up 2 floors with a grand staircase curling toward darkness. A few dim wall sconces buzzed like they were on their last breath. "Hello," Gabe called, cautious but firm. "Electrician emergency, call out." No reply. He followed the soft hum of the breaker panel toward the back. Most of the house was dormant, but one hallway flickered erratically like a haunted film reel. As he moved toward it, the light above his head popped, literally exploded, sending a brief flash across the hardwood. He ducked, then exhaled. Okay. Overload confirmed. Kneeling down, he started examining the faulty junction. Years of improper DIY work, frayed wiring. It was a miracle the place hadn't caught fire. Gabe worked fast, but carefully. He'd seen what bad wiring could do. He'd lived it. Then he noticed something odd. A warm light was coming from under a closed door at the end of the hallway. Not the cold flicker of faulty bulbs, something softer. Deliberate. He hesitated again. He didn't need to go down there. He was almost done. Just a few more connections, then report, then home. But curiosity had a way of slipping in, especially when something felt off. He stood, wiping his hands, and approached the door. Maybe the client had fallen asleep. Maybe someone needed help. Maybe it was just a room with a forgotten lamp. Still, something about that light tugged at him. He knocked once. Silence. He gently pushed the door open and froze. Inside, standing barefoot in a soft white sleep dress, her long hair cascading loosely over her shoulders, was a woman who looked like she'd been waiting for something, perhaps someone. She didn't flinch, didn't cover herself, didn't move toward or away from him. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep solves, but the kind that settles into your soul when you've been carrying silence too long. Their eyes locked. "I'm sorry," Gabe said, quickly stepping back. "I didn't mean to," but she raised a hand gently. Not to stop him, not to welcome him, just to exist between them like a pause. And then she spoke softly, but with the weight of someone who hadn't said anything out loud in hours, maybe days. "Stay," she whispered, "until it's over." Gabe stood there, half inside the doorway, half in the hallway of his old life where nothing like this ever happened. Every instinct told him to nod politely, leave, call the service dispatch, and file the report. This wasn't his business. He was here for a fuse box, not a stranger's sorrow, but something in her voice had cracked just enough to let the truth slip through, and he knew that sound. He had heard it in his daughter's breathing on the nights she almost didn't wake. He had heard it in his own chest on the day the doctor said, "We'll try, but there are no guarantees." He stepped inside, only a few feet. The door clicked shut behind him. Not slammed, just closed, like punctuation at the end of a sentence that neither of them had written. "I'm Gabe," he said quietly. She nodded once. Ela. Neither of them asked the obvious why he stayed or why she wanted him to. Outside, the storm continued. But in that room, time slowed. Not with romance, not with thrill, but with something deeper recognition. Two people who had nothing to offer but presence. And in the end, sometimes that's the only light strong enough to hold back the dark. Isla Whitmore hadn't meant to be awake at 2 a.m. Not on this night. Not in this house. She had arrived back at the estate just before midnight after a full day of polite condolences, cold finger food, and white roses that smelled too clean to mean anything. The memorial service for her father had been held at the downtown hotel ballroom, the very first one he ever bought. They'd dressed it in ivory and gold, like his empire. Guests came and went with perfect manners. Investors wept more convincingly than family. But Isla hadn't cried. Not once. She had simply stood perfectly poised in a black dress tailored for grief while remembering a man whose idea of affection was giving her quarterly reports and handshakes. The legal letter came immediately after a sealed envelope from his estate lawyer. She opened it alone in the back seat of a waiting car. "In the interest of legacy continuity, the inheritance shall transfer to my daughter Isla Whitmore upon the condition that she is married by her 33rd birthday." She read it twice. Her birthday was in 2 days. That night, Isla hadn't returned to her penthouse downtown. She told the driver to take her back to the family estate unused, untouched since before the pandemic. A place filled with old lamps, locked rooms, and the ghost of a childhood that was never truly hers. She hadn't intended to turn the lights on. She only meant to sit in her father's reading room surrounded by the dusty smell of old ledgers and the faint echo of his footsteps. But when she flicked on a switch, the hallway lights crackled violently. One bulb burst. The smell of ozone filled the air. She didn't care. She sat down anyway in her silk nightdress and robe, barefoot on the rug where her mother once read her stories. She stared at the fireless hearth, thinking nothing until the man entered by mistake. Gabe. The name settled in her mind now as she watched him from across the room. He hadn't taken another step. Just stood there looking like someone who'd expected only wires and was given a confession instead. His clothes were damp, his boots slightly muddy. He smelled faintly of copper and pine. His hands were strong. She had noticed that immediately, yet they hung at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them in a room like this. "I thought the room was empty," he said, voice apologetic, not embarrassed. "I was just making sure." "I know," she interrupted. "It's fine." He hesitated, then offered a small, respectful nod. "The electrical panel's a mess. Dangerous, honestly. I should finish the repairs before it sparks again." "You can," she said softly, "but stay after." He looked at her for a long moment. Why? She didn't have the answer. Not one that made sense. Only that when he opened the door, she hadn't felt startled. She hadn't felt the urge to cover herself or hide. His presence hadn't broken the quiet. It had softened it, filled it, because Gabe didn't feel like a stranger. He felt like someone who had spent his life in the quiet corners of other people's stories. someone who saw things without needing them explained. "Because I don't want to be alone tonight," Isla finally said. "And I think maybe you understand what it means when silence becomes too loud." Gabe's face didn't change much, but his shoulders lowered slightly as if something invisible had been lifted. He nodded once. "I'll finish up and come back." She watched him go, listened to his footsteps disappear down the hall, and for the first time in hours her chest rose with a breath that reached the bottom of her lungs. 15 minutes later he returned, boots off, jacket removed, and a small portable tool bag still in hand. "I figured I'd tighten a few sockets in here. This lamp's buzzing," he said, gesturing to the antique floor lamp beside her. She nodded and moved aside. He crouched next to it, gently inspecting the wiring, his fingers skilled and steady. Isla watched him, this man with worn jeans, calloused hands, and a quiet gentleness that felt completely out of place in this house. "How old is your daughter?" she asked. He didn't look up. 8. "Emmy. She has your eyes." He paused as if uncertain how to respond. "I noticed," she added, not pushing. "She's recovering from brain surgery," he said eventually. "They removed a tumor. It was benign, but pressing on her optic nerve. She lost some vision. There's a chance she'll get it back. That's why you work nights. Every extra job helps. Medical insurance only covers so much. And she sleeps better knowing I'm not far." Isla nodded slowly. "She's lucky." "She's why I wake up every morning," he said simply. They sat in silence again, but now it wasn't hollow, it was full, like the quiet of two people sitting near a campfire. Isla stood, walked to a side table, and pulled out an old music box. "My mother used to play this when I couldn't sleep." She wound it slowly. The melody was soft, melancholic, faded from time, but still beautiful. "I haven't opened this in years," she whispered. "I think I forgot it existed." "Sometimes it takes someone else to turn the light back on," Gabe said, eyes meeting hers. They didn't touch. They didn't flirt. They simply sat in the warmth of a room that had been cold for too long. By the time the grandfather clock struck 3 a.m., Gabe stood. "I should go." She looked up. Not desperate, not pleading, just unwilling to break the stillness too quickly. Then, slowly, she walked over to the desk and picked up a blank ivory card. On it, she wrote a single line in delicate blue ink. She handed it to him. Gabe read the words, "Come back in the daylight if you still believe I'm worth saving." He looked at her, searching for meaning. She didn't offer any, just the faintest smile. Fragile, but real, and for a man who spent his nights fixing broken things, that was reason enough to hold on. The sun was rising by the time Gabe pulled into the cracked driveway of the modest duplex he and Emmy called home. The sky glowed faintly orange over the rooftops, promising warmth that hadn't yet reached the ground. He sat in the truck for a moment, hands still curled around the wheel, Isla's note resting on the seat beside him. "Come back in the daylight if you still believe I'm worth saving." He hadn't said a word in response, just tucked the card into his pocket like something sacred, then walked out into the quiet morning air, unsure of what had just happened or what it meant. He had fixed hundreds of lights in 100 different places, but last night felt like the first time he'd been invited to see something that couldn't be rewired with copper and screws. Inside the house, the scent of cinnamon lingered faintly. Maddie had baked something while Emmy slept. A small kindness Gabe never took for granted. He crept into Emmy's room, careful not to wake her. She was still curled on her side, tangled in sheets, her favorite stuffed koala tucked under her arm. A halo of blonde curls framed her face, and her lips moved slightly as if she were speaking to someone in a dream. For a moment, Gabe just stood there. The tension that clung to his shoulders, finances, fatigue, fear melted into the background. His life had narrowed down to these brief, quiet moments. The stillness before the world asked more than he could give. He turned to leave, but her voice caught him. "Daddy." He spun, crouching beside her bed. "Hey, baby. Didn't mean to wake you." Her eyes fluttered open. She reached up and touched the rough stubble along his jaw. "You look tired." "I am." He chuckled softly. "Did you work late?" "Yeah. Fancy house, big as a castle. Did you meet a queen? She asked, half sleepy, half serious. He paused, then smiled. Something like that. Emmy closed her eyes again. You should sleep too, Daddy. The world's quieter when you rest. He kissed her forehead, then pulled the blanket up to her chin. You always say the smartest things. By noon, Gabe was back on his feet. He didn't have the luxury of time, not when rent was due, the hospital bills were stacked, and the van needed new brake pads. But Isla's note burned in his pocket like a weight he hadn't expected to carry. He stood in the kitchen, staring at it again. Why had she written that? Why him? He wasn't the kind of man who saved heiresses. He fixed what others broke. He kept his head down. He lived between paychecks and pediatric appointments. He hadn't sat across from a woman like that since before everything changed. And yet last night she hadn't looked at him like he was less than. She hadn't looked at him like anything really, not a role to play, not a service call, just a person. And he had looked back, not out of curiosity, out of recognition. Later that afternoon, Gabe found himself in his garage sleeves, rolled up sweat dripping down his temples. The engine before him belonged to an old neighbor, a widow on a fixed income who couldn't afford the mechanic shop. Gabe offered to take a look for free. You don't have to do this, she said from the doorway. I know, he replied, hands deep in the wiring, but someone should. She smiled, then added, You remind me of your father, you know. Gabe stilled. He rarely spoke about his father, a man who drank more than he spoke, a man who taught him how to repair things but not how to ask for help. Gabe's hands had grown strong under his father's watch, but his heart had learned gentleness from his mother, and later after tragedy from raising Emmy alone. Maybe he said quietly, But I like to think I've unlearned some things too. She left him a pitcher of lemonade before she walked off, and Gabe worked in silence, letting the memory of Isla drift through his mind like a song he couldn't place. That evening, he sat with Emmy on the back porch. She was coloring a picture of their dog, Charlie, who had passed away 2 years earlier, but still lived vividly in her world. Did you know, she said suddenly, that some lights don't need wires? Gabe blinked. What do you mean, like people? Sometimes people carry light. You don't see it, but you feel warm when they're around. He stared at her for a long time, then reached into his pocket. He unfolded Isla's note again. Read it one more time. Come back in the daylight if you still believe I'm worth saving. He did. He didn't know why, but he did. The next morning, Gabe stood in front of the Whitmore estate, sunlight creeping across the carefully manicured hedges. He wore a clean shirt, his boots polished, his hair combed back. Not because he was trying to impress her, but because for the first time in a long time he wanted to show up fully as himself, not just the repairman, not just the single dad, but a man still capable of hope. He knocked. No answer. His heart thudded louder than it should. But then the door eased open, not by an assistant, not by staff, but by Isla herself. She was barefoot again, but this time in jeans and a loose sweater, her hair pulled up, no silk, no shadow. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of him. You came back, she said, as if still testing whether it was real. Gabe held up the note. I still believe. And something in her, something deep, relaxed. The tension in her jaw, the guarded line of her mouth, it softened. I made coffee, she said simply. But it's terrible. He smiled. Lucky for you, I come with tools. And just like that, the space between them wasn't silence anymore. It was beginning. The coffee was as bad as advertised, burnt thin and tasting vaguely like cardboard. But Gabe drank it anyway, not because of the caffeine, but because of the woman who offered it to him. Isla sat across the long kitchen island, her fingers curled around her mug like she needed its warmth to stay anchored in the room. The morning sun filtered through the glass wall behind her, catching dust motes in the air and lighting her hair like a soft flame. Her posture was composed, but her eyes betrayed the storm beneath. This kitchen was remodeled 3 times, she said, almost absent-mindedly. My father believed modern spaces kept the mind sharp. But the coffee machine is from 1996, and I've never figured out how to replace the filter." Gabe smiled. "It's got character, so did he, but character doesn't always translate to kindness." She set the mug down gently, like she was afraid to wake something that had been sleeping too long. Gabe didn't press her. He knew silence was sometimes safer than the wrong words. Finally, Isla spoke again. "I read the letter the day of the memorial. I didn't open it at first. I thought maybe if I waited, the terms would change, like grief had a grace period." He waited. "He left me everything," she continued, "but only if I marry before I turn 33. Gabe's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's in 20 hours. Her voice was dry. "I'd laugh if it didn't feel like such a cruel joke." "Is that even legal?" "It's not illegal," she said. "Conditional inheritance clauses are enforceable if written clearly and not discriminatory. And he had the best lawyers money could buy." "Trust me, I asked." Gabe leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. "So, if you don't marry, you lose billions. Properties, influence, the whole empire." She paused. "He didn't just want a legacy. He wanted it to look a certain way. Married, respectable, controlled." "That's not a legacy," Gabe said quietly. "That's a leash." Isla looked at him, her eyes sharp but not defensive. "You're the first person who said that without sounding sorry for me. I don't think you want pity," he said. "I think you want someone to see it for what it is." The air between them grew still. "Last night," she said, voice softer now, "when you walked into that room, I wasn't waiting for anyone. Not really. I just couldn't move, couldn't sleep. It was like I was made of glass. I felt hollow. And now," he asked. "I'm still hollow," she admitted. "But now it's like someone turned on a light inside." Gabe's breath caught, not because of the words, but because he knew exactly what she meant. He had felt it too, years ago on the hospital bench the first night Emmy was diagnosed. That strange, shattering moment when the world falls apart and someone a stranger even sits beside you. Doesn't fix it, doesn't speak, just stays. Sometimes staying is the miracle. Isla led him through the house afterward barefoot on cool tile. They passed through rooms too grand for comfort, vaulted ceilings, chandeliers dusted with memory walls lined with paintings of men in tailored suits. Gabe noticed how she hesitated near certain doors, how her fingers brushed the frames like she was remembering more than the architecture. "This was my mother's study," she said, stopping outside a pale blue room. "It's been locked since she died." "Why?" "Because I never had the courage to go back in." She opened it now with a key from a chain around her neck. The door creaked softly. Inside, time had held its breath. The space was delicate and sunlit, filled with the scent of lavender and old books. A grand piano sat in one corner, sheet music still resting on the stand. On the desk, a lamp with a frayed cord, a crystal inkwell, and a faded photograph of Isla at age 7 sitting in her mother's lap. "I used to sneak in here to read," Isla whispered. "She'd pretend not to see me. Just kept playing her music." Gabe stepped inside, drawn not by curiosity but by the way the room seemed to still Isla's breathing. He moved toward the desk, noting the broken switch on the lamp. "May I?" he asked. She nodded. He pulled a screwdriver from his belt pouch. "This wiring is ancient, but it can be fixed. She always said the light in this room was different." Gabe worked in silence for a minute, fingers moving with instinctive care. Then he flicked the switch. The bulb glowed a warm, golden pulse. Isla gasped softly. "I thought it was broken forever." "Most things aren't," he said. "They just need someone who knows where to look." They sat on the window seat after that, knees nearly touching. Outside, a breeze stirred the trees. Inside, the air held still. Gabe turned to her. "What happens if you don't sign anything tomorrow? I lose the company, the trust, the name maybe. And what do you keep myself?" He nodded. "That might be worth more than you think." She smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "Everyone around me keeps asking who I'll marry. Which businessman? Which partner? They all think this is a transaction. And I don't want a transaction. I want something real, even if it's small, even if it doesn't come with headlines or money or power." Gabe hesitated, then said, "I can't offer much, Isla. I fix things. I'm good with wires, not with wealth. You're good with broken lamps," she said, "and broken silences." She reached for his hand, then not in romance but in gratitude. "In truth, I don't know what tomorrow brings," she whispered, "but thank you for showing up, in the dark, when I didn't know I needed it." He held her hand gently. "Thank you for inviting me to stay." The moment held. And in that sunlit corner of an old house filled with ghosts, something new began to stir, quiet, fragile, and full of light. Gabe left the Whitmore estate just after noon, but the memory of it followed him like sunlight on his skin. The scent of lavender still lingered on his shirt, a faint echo of Isla's mother's study. He didn't know exactly what he'd walked into that morning, or why he was so certain it mattered, but something had shifted. Not just in Isla, in him. He'd gone there out of respect, maybe curiosity, but he hadn't expected to feel seen. Not for the scars or the calluses or the wear and tear of fatherhood and grief, but for the simple presence of being human in someone else's storm. He drove home slowly, letting the road hum beneath his tires as his thoughts churned. Her note was tucked back into his shirt pocket as if it belonged there. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring for Isla or for himself, but something in her voice when she said, "I want something real," had carved itself into his chest. That afternoon, he and Emmy sat on the front porch with a jigsaw puzzle spread out between them, pieces dancing in the breeze. Daddy, Emmy asked, squinting at a piece shaped like a duck, "What's an heiress?" Gabe blinked, nearly dropping a corner piece of sky. "Where'd you hear that?" "You said it yesterday. To the neighbor, about the lady in the big house." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "It means someone who inherits something big. Usually money, sometimes companies, sometimes problems." Emmy frowned. "Why would someone want to inherit problems?" "They don't. Sometimes they come with the package." She thought for a moment, then asked, "Is she nice?" Gabe paused. "She's more than nice." Emmy nodded seriously, placing a cloud into the sky. "I think people with money forget how to see things." Maybe she needed someone to remind her. Gabe stared at his daughter for a long moment, overwhelmed by how simply she saw the world. Maybe she needed someone to remind her. Maybe that was what he'd done. Maybe that was all any of them were meant to do for each other, remind, not rescue. That evening, Gabe paced the hallway after putting Emmy to bed. He should have been filling out invoices, fixing the bathroom door, or tackling the pile of unopened hospital bills stacked beside the fridge. But instead, he found himself holding Isla's note again. "Come back in the daylight if you still believe I'm worth saving." What struck him wasn't the plea in her words, it was the vulnerability, the quiet challenge. Isla hadn't begged him to return. She had offered him a question, and somehow he'd answered without speaking. He didn't know what she expected now, didn't know if she wanted friendship guidance or something entirely unnamed. He just knew she hadn't asked anyone else to stay, and that meant something. The next day, the day of her 33rd birthday, began with sunlight and silence. Ela stood alone in the vast dining room, a room large enough to seat 20 and full of echoes. A single place setting was arranged at one end, absurd in its formality. The estate lawyer had sent her documents that morning, papers to forfeit the inheritance if no legal marriage certificate was filed by midnight. She hadn't signed them, not yet. But they sat on the table beside a pen with her name engraved in gold. The house was quiet, staff dismissed. No stylists, no press, no arranged suitors. Just Isla barefoot again, dressed in soft linen, and the fragile defiance of someone choosing herself over a legacy. She walked into the garden, unsure what she was looking for. The roses her mother planted had bloomed again, late unexpected. Life, it seemed, did what it wanted regardless of instruction. As she sat on the stone bench, a familiar sound interrupted her thoughts. Gravel. Tires. A car door. She rose, heart thudding. "Gabe." He stepped through the gate like he'd always belonged there, holding nothing but a small brown paper bag and the look of someone who had made a choice before arriving. "I didn't bring flowers," he said as he approached, offering the bag with a shy half-smile. She opened it. Inside was a half-dozen chocolate chip muffins, slightly lopsided but warm. "You made these." "I tried." Emmy supervised. Isla laughed, the sound surprising even to her. "They smell better than the coffee. I figured breakfast is a better way to celebrate a birthday than contracts." She looked at him. Really looked and saw no pity in his eyes. No agenda. Just a man who had shown up again in the daylight without being asked. "Do you know what I almost did this morning?" she said, voice low. He shook his head. "I almost signed those papers. Almost handed everything back just to be free. And now," she looked out toward the roses, "now I'm realizing freedom doesn't mean having nothing. It means having the right something you choose." Gabe nodded. "Even if it's small. Even if it doesn't come with money or titles." She turned to him. "You don't know how rare it is to find someone who listens, who sees beyond the window dressing." "I don't need the window," he said. "I see the light." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Isla stepped closer. "I don't know what this is," she said softly. "I don't know what tomorrow brings. But today, I want to choose something real." Gabe reached for her hand. "Then let's start with muffins and see what happens." She smiled, eyes shimmering. "Deal." Inside, the clock ticked toward noon. The legal deadline loomed. But neither of them moved toward the contracts. Instead, they sat on the garden bench sharing imperfect muffins and stories that weren't ready-made for headlines. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't signing away millions or taking a stand. Sometimes it's simply staying. Staying when the world expects you to run. Staying when silence feels louder than noise. Staying when someone says, "I don't want to be alone," and you say back without hesitation, "You won't be." And in that truth, something deeper began to grow. Not out of obligation, not out of rescue, but out of choice. The shrill ring of Gabe's phone cut through the stillness of the morning like a blade. He had just stepped out of Isla's garden, the warmth of her smile and the softness of her voice still clinging to him like morning mist. For a brief, fragile hour he'd forgotten the rest of the world. Forgotten the weight he always carried. Forgotten, most dangerously of all, that peace for him was always temporary. It was Maddie on the other end, his teenage neighbor and Emmy's part-time babysitter. "Gabe," she said, breathless. Emmy collapsed. His feet stopped moving. The quiet beauty of the Whitmore estate vanished behind him like a mirage. "What do you mean, collapsed?" She said her head hurt, then just dropped. "I called 911. We're at County General." Everything in Gabe's body went cold. "I'm on my way," he said already, sprinting to his truck, the paper bag of muffins falling forgotten to the gravel. County General was 30 minutes away, but Gabe made it in 20. He burst into the ERIs, scanning for anyone familiar. "Emmy Keller," he said at the front desk, barely able to keep his voice steady. "She was brought in an hour ago. 8 years old." The nurse nodded, typing quickly. "She's in pediatric observation. Room 7B. She's stable." He didn't hear the rest. He ran. Inside the curtained room, Emmy lay on a hospital bed V-line snaking from her arm. Her small body looked even smaller beneath the pale blue blanket. Machines beeped quietly beside her. A nurse was adjusting a monitor as Gabe entered, face pale with worry. Emmy opened her eyes as he approached. "Daddy," she whispered, weak but clear. He dropped to his knees beside her bed, taking her hand into both of his. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." She blinked slowly. "My head hurt. Then I got dizzy." The nurse stepped in. Her CT scan showed increased intracranial pressure, likely a complication from the scar tissue around the optic nerve. She'll need monitoring and possibly a minor intervention to relieve it. Nothing invasive right now, but we're keeping her overnight. Gabe nodded, fighting to keep his hands from trembling. He sat there for hours, not moving, barely breathing the memory of Isla's garden now 1,000 miles away. It was dusk when Isla called. He hadn't realized she'd noticed he was gone. The phone vibrated in his pocket for a while before he answered. "I didn't expect you to leave so fast," she said gently. "Is everything okay?" Gabe exhaled. "No. Emmy's in the hospital. Complications." "I'm so sorry," Isla said, voice immediately softening. "Is she—" "She'll be all right, they say, but she scared the hell out of me. Do you want company?" He hesitated. He wanted to say yes, but he couldn't. "This isn't your place," he said. "This is mine. My world. Fluorescent lights and chart printouts and chairs too small to sleep in. And you think I can't sit in that with you. It's not about you not being able to. It's about me needing to be her father first. I'm not asking you to be anything else." Gabe looked at his daughter, her chest rising and falling in sleep. "I just can't bring two worlds together right now." There was a pause. Not angry, just quiet. Then Isla said, "Then let me know when you're ready." And she hung up. That night, Gabe stayed by Emmy's side, his body rigid in the too small chair. He watched the monitors flicker, remembering the first time they'd done this. Back then, he'd had no idea what to ask. Now he knew the terms, the fears, the delays insurance would bring. He knew the smell of bleach and stress and vending machine coffee, and he also knew that somewhere in another part of the city a woman was sitting in a house filled with empty rooms wondering if she'd made the right decision in letting go of everything just to feel something real. He reached into his jacket pocket. The note was still there. "Come back in the daylight if you still believe I'm worth saving." He ran his fingers across it, then tucked it into Emmy's overnight bag. In the morning, a doctor came in with better news. The pressure had stabilized overnight. No surgery needed. They'd keep her one more day for monitoring, then likely discharge her. Gabe felt his shoulders sag, the breath in his chest finally escaping. Emmy stirred. "Can I go home?" "Soon, honey. Real soon." She nodded, then added quietly, "Can you call the lady?" Gabe blinked. "What lady? The one from the garden? The one with the soft voice?" He smiled faintly. "You remember her?" Emmy nodded. "She looked sad when you left." Gabe brushed her curls back. "Yeah, she probably was. Maybe she needs light too." At noon, Gabe stepped outside to get some fresh air. The hospital courtyard was quiet, a few nurses on break birds chirping in the trees. He pulled out his phone, then stopped. What would he even say? "I'm sorry, my child had a medical emergency, and I ran from what might have been the first moment of peace either of us had known in years." But as he stood there, the hospital door opened behind him, and Isla walked through. Not in heels, not in silk, just jeans flats and a simple blouse. She held a brown paper bag and 2 coffees in a cardboard tray. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she said, "but I figured you wouldn't be the one to ask." Gabe stared at her, something in his chest cracking wide open. "I didn't want to ask," he said, voice hoarse, "because I didn't want to need it." "Too bad," she replied, stepping closer. "Because I'm here anyway." She handed him one of the coffees, then sat beside him on the bench. They didn't speak for a long while. And they didn't need to, because sometimes the light you need most isn't the kind that comes from a lamp or the sun. Sometimes it's someone who walks into the emergency room without needing an invitation, just to remind you that you're not alone in the dark. The day after Emmy was discharged, Gabe found himself back in his garage, elbow deep in the guts of an old Ford pickup that belonged to one of the neighborhood veterans. The rhythmic clang of tools and hum of the work radio should have been comforting a return to normal. But his thoughts were restless, drifting back to Isla's face as she sat beside him on that hospital bench, calm, present, without judgment. She hadn't said much. She didn't need to. She just showed up, brought him coffee, stayed until Emmy woke up, then left with nothing more than a nod and a quiet, "You know how to find me." He hadn't called since, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know if he could give her anything that didn't feel temporary. His life, full of duct tape fixes and financial stretch marks, felt like something held together by hope and overdue bills. Isla, for all her vulnerability, still walked in a world of legacy and expectations, even if she'd chosen to walk away from it. She deserved more than a man who counted quarters for gas. Or at least, that's what he kept telling himself. Until Emmy, sitting on the floor of the garage coloring a page of butterflies, said without looking up, "Why haven't you seen the garden lady again?" Gabe wiped his hands on a rag. "Because she has her own life, and I have mine. She came to the hospital." "Yeah, she didn't have to." "I know." Emmy glanced up, her expression serious in that strangely old-soul way that made Gabe feel like she'd been here before. "Then maybe she's already in your life." That night, Isla sat at the long dining room table with a cup of untouched tea and a blank envelope in front of her. She hadn't heard from Gabe since the hospital, and though she told herself he needed space, the silence felt heavier than she expected. Maybe she'd crossed a line by showing up. Maybe he wasn't ready for someone like her. Or maybe she wasn't ready for someone like him. Someone who didn't need her money. Someone who didn't pretend. Someone who could sit in grief and still hold light. She turned the envelope over in her hands. It held an invitation official and gold embossed from the Whitmore Board of Directors. They were holding an emergency meeting in 2 days. The company had taken a hit since her father's passing scandals, mishandled funds, and growing public distrust. They wanted her to return, as a figurehead, a lifeline. One of them had written a note at the bottom in ink she recognized from childhood boardroom memos, "You are the last clean name we have. Come back and we'll hand you the keys." She could reclaim it all, or she could let it burn. The next morning, Isla did something she hadn't done in over a decade. She walked downtown. Not with a driver, not with an assistant, just her hair tied back, sunglasses on, dressed in jeans and a jacket that still smelled faintly of lavender. She didn't know where Gabe lived. He'd never told her. Never mentioned an address, a street, not even a neighborhood. All she knew was the name of the hospital and the little coffee shop across from it, the one with the cracked chalkboard sign and the burnt scones. She went there first, and sat, and waited. By noon, she'd bought 2 coffees. One, hot one, lukewarm. At 12:30, an older man came in, a retired nurse who'd worked pediatrics for years. Isla didn't recognize him, but he did her. "Miss Whitmore." She turned startled. "Yes, I saw you at the hospital the other day. You were with the man in room 7B. Her breath caught. "You know him?" "Not well, but I know of him. Gabe Keller, works with his hands. Daughter's been through a lot." Isla nodded, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Do you know where he lives?" The man hesitated. "I can't give you his address, but I've seen him near East Maple. He volunteers at the community garage behind the church sometimes. Helps kids learn to fix bikes." Her throat tightened. "Thank you," she said genuinely. Truly. By 2 p.m., Isla found herself standing on a cracked sidewalk outside a modest one-story house with a creaking mailbox and a tiny porch swing. There was no name on the door, no sign, but she saw a girl, blonde, laughing, wearing a pink helmet, riding a slightly wobbly bicycle in the driveway. And Gabe crouched beside the hedge, fixing a sprinkler head covered in grass stains. He didn't see her at first, not until Emmy called Daddy. "She's here." Gabe turned and froze. Isla stood there, unsure if she should speak first or run, but Emmy waved. "Hi, garden lady," Isla smiled. "Hi, Emmy." Gabe stood slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You found me. I had help." They stared at each other for a beat. Then Gabe walked closer, stopping just short. "I didn't mean to disappear. I didn't come here for an explanation. Then why did you come?" She reached into her pocket and pulled out the gold invitation. "Because I was offered everything I used to want. Power, status, control. But I kept thinking about a man who fixes broken things and a girl who sees light in people." He exhaled slowly. "And I don't want to be a figurehead. I don't want a legacy built on someone else's blueprint." She looked at him, voice steady. But maybe I want to build something else. Something smaller. Realer. Gabe didn't smile. He just stepped forward and took her hand. I'm not a shortcut to anything, he said. And I can't promise a quiet life. I'm not asking for quiet, Isla whispered. I'm asking for true. Emmy, still circling on her bike, shouted, Can we keep her? Both adults burst out laughing, and in that moment, surrounded by peeling paint, squeaky tires, and sunlight slanting through the trees, they knew this wasn't the end of a search. It was the beginning of a home. The next morning, sunlight spilled gently across Gabe's modest kitchen table, catching in the steam that curled above 2 mismatched mugs of coffee. Isla sat in one of the old wooden chairs, her posture relaxed, hands wrapped around her cup like she was grounding herself. She wore one of Gabe's flannel shirts over her own clothes, oversized, a little frayed at the cuffs, but she wore it like it belonged to her. Emmy sat between them, devouring a bowl of cereal, oblivious to the quiet tension that danced in the air between her father and the woman who had somehow become part of their rhythm. She wants to plant flowers, Emmy announced suddenly, mouth full of cornflakes. Isla blinked. I do. You said yesterday you liked my bike path, Emmy replied. We could add roses. Daddy's bad with flowers, but he can dig holes. Gabe smirked. That's not entirely inaccurate. Isla smiled, her eyes drifting toward the small patch of yard visible through the window. Then we'll need gloves and sunlight. And patience. Emmy beamed. I have lots of patience. Gabe raised an eyebrow. Really? Emmy nodded, solemn as a judge. I waited for Mommy to come back for a long time. The air shifted. Isla didn't speak. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She simply reached across the table and took Emmy's hand gently, her touch light but steady. I'm so sorry, she said softly. Emmy nodded. It's okay. I think she's light now. Like a star. Maybe 2. Gabe swallowed hard, his voice quiet. That's what she used to tell Emmy. Even if I'm far, I'll be the light you see when it's darkest. Isla blinked rapidly. She had grown up in a house where loss was discussed in quarterly adjustments and scheduled grief. This quiet, messy, luminous kind of love, it was a language she was still learning. Later that day, the 3 of them ventured into Isla's old world, though it didn't feel like hers anymore. The small storefront sat on a sleepy downtown block, a weathered building with large windows and empty space she'd inherited before her father passed, but had never known what to do with. It had sat vacant for years, its only tenants the ghosts of ambition and indecision. Now, Gabe stood beside her, holding Emmy's hand, and stared up at the blank signage above the door. You really want to do this? He asked. Isla exhaled. Yes. Not to prove anything. Just to begin something I believe in. Inside, the dust smelled like time, but the bones of the space were good exposed brick, a tall ceiling, and soft light pouring in from the skylights above. I want to make it a place where people feel like they belong, she said. Not for profit, for community. A small cafe, books, conversations, maybe even a corner for kids to read while their parents breathe. Gabe smiled slowly. You just described the opposite of every Whitmore boardroom. She grinned. Exactly. He walked to the center of the room, running his hand along an old wooden support beam. You'll need someone who can wire this place safely. She tilted her head. No, anyone I might. Emmy tugged at Isla's hand. Will it have cookies? The best ones, Isla promised. Can I help decorate? You can lead the decorating committee. Emmy nodded, satisfied. And Gabe, watching the 2 of them standing in that dusty, sunlit space, felt something settle inside him. It wasn't certainty. It was readiness. That night, after Emmy had fallen asleep with paint chips and fabric swatches tucked around her, Gabe stepped out onto the porch where Isla stood looking up at the stars. I didn't ask you to stay, he said, voice low back, when I disappeared after the hospital. She didn't turn. I know. But you did. Now she looked at him, her expression unreadable in the silver light. I stayed because it wasn't about what you asked, she said. It was about what I felt, and I felt like you needed someone to witness that moment, not fix it. He nodded. You were right. She took a breath. And I didn't come to ask anything either, Gabe. I didn't come looking for a life I could borrow. I came because I saw something in you that I needed to remember existed. What's that someone who shows up? Not for show, but for real. He stepped closer, the space between them humming with something unspoken. I don't have much to offer, Isla. I live paycheck to paycheck. My truck barely holds heat in winter. My daughter is the center of my world and always will be. That's the deal. Her voice didn't waver. Then it sounds like I'm being offered something rare. He blinked. You're not afraid of the life I come with. No, she whispered. I'm afraid of walking back into the one I left behind. They stood in silence, the porch creaking beneath their feet, stars wheeling overhead. Then she leaned forward just enough that her forehead touched his. I'm not asking for guarantees, she said. Just this, when I reach out, don't let go. I won't. Even when it's hard, I've done hard, he said gently. But I've never done it with someone who believed in the light. She smiled faintly. And in that quiet under that sky, with no press, no contracts, and no inherited expectations, two people who hadn't planned for each other simply stayed. Not because they were perfect, but because they were present. And sometimes that's the only thing that saves us. The storefront buzzed with new energy. Paint cans lined the walls like promises. Hand tools were strewn across old tables. Ila's carefully drawn sketches for the layout. Reading nooks, a community notice board, a tiny children's corner were pinned beside blueprints marked with Gabe's neat, methodical notes. Emmy had claimed the back wall as her own and was now creating a jungle mural featuring a pink giraffe and a raccoon wearing sunglasses. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Gabe stood on a ladder, rewiring a ceiling fixture, dust in his hair and a pencil behind his ear. Below him, Isla balanced on a small stepladder, her hand steadying a new light fixture she insisted on installing herself. Left or right, he asked, adjusting the beam. Left, no wait. Right, definitely right. He grinned. You sure? No. He chuckled and reached for the screwdriver. You're getting better at admitting it. She looked up at him, her smile softening. That's what happens when you stop trying to impress everyone and start trusting someone. Gabe paused, eyes meeting hers. The ladder creaked beneath him, and for a moment the noise of the day, the scraping, the humming, the distant hammering, fell away. Thank you, he said. For what? For choosing this? All of it. I didn't choose a place, she said. I chose a direction. You just happened to be standing there. He tightened the last screw and flicked the switch. The light came on steady, warm, perfect. They both stared at it for a beat. Isla blinked. You fixed it? Gabe gave her a wry smile. That's kind of my thing. But not everything could be fixed. Not with wire, not with tools. 2 days later, an envelope arrived at Isla's home, thicker than usual, sealed with the Whitmore crest. She opened it in the early morning light with Gabe beside her, coffee in hand. Inside were copies of financial records from the past 18 months, illegal allocations, quiet buyouts, a forged signature. Her father's empire wasn't just crumbling, it was compromised deeply. The board hadn't just mismanaged, they had manipulated, stolen. And now they wanted her to come back to be their public shield while they protected their own interests behind closed doors. They want me to be the face of something rotten, she said barely above a whisper. Gabe set his mug down gently. Can you expose them? Not without consequences. The press would devour it. Investors would sue. They'd tear me apart for letting it happen under my family name, even though you didn't know. That doesn't matter. The name on the building is still mine. She rubbed her temples, the weight of years pressing down like concrete. Gabe stood. So, what do you want to do? She looked at him, tired but clear-eyed. What's right? That afternoon, Isla met with her attorney, a woman named Judith, who had once worked for her father, but had since retired, disillusioned by the machine. Isla trusted her precisely because she had walked away when no one else had. "You'll lose everything," Judith said, calmly reading the documents. "I already walked away from everything," Isla replied. "This just makes it official." Judith leaned back. "And what do you want in return?" "Nothing, except for them to stop using my name to justify their greed." Judith studied her. "You've changed. I've started listening to voices that don't echo," Isla said quietly. Judith nodded once. "Then let's do it. Clean break, public statement, full transparency, whatever it takes." News broke 2 days later. Isla Whitmore publicly disavows Whitmore Holdings amid internal audit scandal. "I will not protect what I do not stand behind," she says. The media spun. Former colleagues called. Some begged, some threatened. But Isla stayed firm. She didn't flinch. She didn't hide. She stood. And Gabe stood beside her, not on camera, not in public, but in every moment after when the lights went off and the world stopped clapping. "You're not angry?" "I burned it down," she asked one night as they sat in the backyard, Emmy fast asleep inside the stars overhead, clearer than they'd been in weeks. "No," Gabe said. "I'm proud." She turned to him, surprised. "Why?" "Because you didn't burn it out of rage. You lit the fire so others could see what was hiding in the dark." Isla looked at him, eyes brimming. "That's the kindest thing anyone's ever said to me." He reached for her hand. "You've always had the light, Isla. The world just taught you to dim it to survive." She leaned into him, her voice a whisper. "You taught me I didn't have to." They sat in silence after that, not the heavy kind, not the waiting kind. Just the kind of silence that fills the spaces between two people when everything that needed to be said had already found its way home. The next morning, Gabe returned to the community center where he'd been volunteering on weekends. The space was full of teenagers learning how to change oil fix brakes, solder wires. He loved it there because nothing was performative. It was about hands and honesty. He told Isla about it weeks ago in passing. That day she showed up in sneakers, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, and asked, "Teach me how to fix something." He handed her a wrench. "You're already doing that." That evening, back at the storefront, Emmy ran through the space now cleared of dust and clutter. Bookshelves had been delivered. The coffee bar was nearly finished. The children's corner had beanbags and coloring books. It was no longer an empty dream. It was becoming. And above the doorway, the new sign had just gone up. Second light. Isla turned to Gabe. "It's what you said that first night, when you fixed the lamp." He smiled. "Most things aren't broken forever. They just need someone who knows where to look." She reached up and brushed a speck of sawdust from his jaw. "So do people." They stood there as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting the first golden light through the big front windows. It fell across the floors and shelves, across the laughter of a little girl drawing a raccoon in sunglasses, and across the hands of two people who had every reason to give up, but hadn't. Some lights couldn't be fixed with tools, but some could be rebuilt with love, with truth, and with the courage to start again. Together. The first time the sign lit up, Isla cried. It wasn't loud or theatrical. There were no cameras, no ceremony. Just a quiet Tuesday evening as dusk settled over the street and the windows of the new cafe glowed. For the first time, their soft, golden light spilling onto the sidewalk. Gabe had flipped the switch himself after days of rewiring the vintage fixture she insisted on using, one that had belonged to her mother. The filament buzzed faintly to life, casting a warm, honey-colored glow over the hand-painted sign above the door. Second light. Isla stood there in the street, Emmy beside her holding a cup of cocoa, and covered her mouth with one trembling hand. "I didn't think I'd feel it," she whispered. Feel what Gabe asked, like I was really beginning again, like this wasn't just a detour, like this was mine. Gabe's voice was low. "It is." Behind them, a small crowd had started to gather, neighbors, volunteers, curious passers-by. They clapped politely when Isla cut a simple ribbon at the entrance. No press, no headlines, just people who wanted to see something good begin. Inside, the air smelled of fresh wood coffee beans and lemon polish. The space was warm, filled with mismatched furniture they'd collected from second-hand stores and donations. A reading nook in the corner featured old armchairs, an antique lamp Gabe had rewired, and a sign in Emmy's handwriting that read, "Quiet zone only, kind words allowed." Local artists had contributed paintings. Isla's shelves were filled with books from her personal library, everything from poetry to picture books. And near the front counter was a donation-based menu, pay what you can, or pay it forward. It was the opposite of everything Isla had known. And it was perfect. By noon, the next day, a woman in her 70s had taken up residence in the window seat with a knitting bag. A man in work boots brought his teenage son to help stack books. A mother with a stroller stopped in for coffee and stayed for 2 hours reading while her baby slept. It wasn't profitable. Not yet. Maybe never. But it was alive. That evening, Gabe stood behind the counter helping wash mugs when Isla came up beside him, hair slightly messy, cheeks flushed from hours of conversation and organizing. "You okay?" he asked. She leaned against the counter looking out at the space. "I've never worked this hard without anyone watching. It feels strange, and really, really good." He handed her a towel. "You're allowed to enjoy building something that doesn't belong in a press release." She dried a mug, then looked at him. "I don't want this to just be mine." He glanced over. "What do you mean? I mean—" She hesitated, then found the courage. "I want to build this life with you. Not just this place. Not just a project. I want the long days and the mess and the moments we don't see coming. I want you." Gabe stilled the dish in his hand, half rinsed. Then he said, very simply, "I thought you'd never say that." She laughed, soft and full. "I thought I wasn't allowed to want something that had no blueprint." "There's no blueprint for this," he said, drying his hands. "But I know how to build it." She reached for his hand. And in front of the counter beside the tip jar, labeled "Fuel, the kindness they kissed, gentle, quiet, and real." Later that night back home, Gabe tucked Emmy into bed. She clutched her well-worn koala and looked up at him. "Are we staying here now?" she asked sleepily. He brushed her curls from her forehead. "What do you mean?" "With the garden lady." "Are we staying? Like staying?" Gabe smiled. "We're not going anywhere, Peanut. We're exactly where we're meant to be." She nodded once. "Good. I like her. She smells like books and cookies." He laughed softly. "She does. Did she make you happy again?" He paused. "I don't know if she made me happy, but she reminded me I was allowed to be." Emmy closed her eyes. "Then don't forget." "I won't," he whispered. Isla, that same night, stood in the quiet of the cafe alone, flipping the chairs onto the tables one by one. She moved slowly, reverently, as if honoring each piece of this new life. Then she walked to the front door, reached for the chain to shut off the sign, and stopped. Instead, she left it on. A quiet declaration. "We're here. We're open. Even when no one's watching." She stepped outside, wrapped her coat tighter around her, and looked up at the light. The same fixture that had once burned out in the darkness of her family's estate now glowed above something honest, something healing. Behind her, on the chalkboard out front, Emmy had written in bright pink chalk, "Second chances deserve a second light." Isla stood under the glow for a long moment. Then she whispered into the quiet night, "Thank you. Not to anyone in particular. Just to the universe, to the choice, to the courage it took to walk away from everything expected. And into something earned." Back at home, Gabe stood at his kitchen window staring up at the same sky. He could see the faint reflection of Isla's cafe sign glowing in the distance. And in that light, he saw a life. Not perfect, not without hardship, but true. He turned off the kitchen light, the house quiet. And in the darkness, something deeper stirred. Not the end of struggle, just the beginning of peace. A second light earned. It had been exactly 1 year since Gabe Keller walked through the wrong door at 2 a.m. 1 year since Isla Whitmore, barefoot and lost in a quiet house full of ghosts, had whispered the words that unknowingly shifted the path of 2 lives. Stay until it's over. Only neither of them had understood in that fragile moment what it truly was. Grief, loneliness, the weight of legacy, the ache of single fatherhood, the invisible silence that clings to people who've been strong for too long. Now, 1 year later, the words had a different meaning. Not an invitation to linger, but a promise to remain. The cafe was closed for the evening, but inside the air was filled with music and laughter. String lights danced overhead. Long tables had been pushed together. Friends, volunteers, and neighbors sat elbow to elbow, passing homemade dishes, sipping lemonade, and sharing stories like family. It wasn't an anniversary party. It wasn't a grand opening or fundraiser. It was just togetherness. The kind that can't be scheduled, only grown. Gabe stood behind the counter pouring hot cider into mugs. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows and the scent of cinnamon clung to his skin. He glanced across the room and caught sight of Enidla crouched beside a boy showing her his drawing of a dragon reading a book. She laughed, her face open and unguarded, and Gabe felt something inside him pause, not in hesitation but in awe. A year ago, she was glass. Now she was firelight. Warm, steady, alive. Emmy, now 9 and taller than ever, bounded up to Gabe and tugged at his arm. "Come outside. It's starting." What's starting? The lanterns. He followed her outside where a small crowd had gathered in the alley-turned garden behind the cafe. The night sky stretched wide above them, the moon round and low. Strings of paper lanterns sat in baskets, each with a small slip of paper tucked inside. Ela appeared beside him, slipping her hand into his without a word. He looked at her. "I thought we weren't doing anything big," he teased. "This isn't big, it's quiet, which is what we all needed." Gabe read the sign posted near the lanterns. "A light for what we've lost. A light for what we've found." One by one, people lit their lanterns, whispering hopes or names or unspoken prayers. Children released theirs with squeals. Elders let them go with tears in their eyes. No music played. Just the sound of laughter, wind, and wonder. Gabe knelt beside Emmy, helping her hold the base of her lantern. "Who's yours for?" he asked. She smiled. "Mom. And also Charlie. And also you, Daddy." "Me? Yeah. Because I found you again this year." Gabe's throat tightened. "I never left. I know," she said simply. "But you came back with more." She let go and the lantern floated up, rising slowly, joining dozens of others flickering like low stars. Later, when the sky was full and the air grew cooler, the guests trickled home, leaving the alley lit with soft glows and the scent of lemon cake. Inside the cafe, Gabe sat at the window seat with Isla, the two of them wrapped in a shared blanket, watching the last lantern drift higher. "Do you ever think about that night?" Isla asked, voice barely above a whisper. "All the time. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't opened that door?" Gabe turned to her. "No." "Why?" "Because I believe I would have found you anyway." She leaned her head against his shoulder, eyes shining. "I think so, too. But I'm still glad it was that way. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't planned, but it was honest." He kissed the top of her head. "The best things usually are." They sat in silence after that. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been said. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the ivy that curled around the cafe windows. The sign, "Second Light," flickered for a moment, then glowed stronger as if responding to the night. Later, after Isla had turned off the lights and locked the door after Emmy had fallen asleep in the cozy back room with a book on her chest and a blanket over her feet, Gabe walked with Isla toward the car. They stopped just before getting in. He looked at her in the moonlight, brushing a stray curl from her cheek. "You once told me to stay," he said quietly. "Until it was over." She nodded, smiling. "But I don't think it ever really ends," he added. "I think the best kind of love just changes shape. From light to shadow. From grief to grace." She looked up at him, eyes glistening. Then, "Stay through all of it." "I will." And as they stood there under the same stars they'd once watched from separate lives, Gabe understood something he hadn't fully known until now. That love isn't what begins when the pain ends. Love is what stays through the ache, through the questions, through the quiet rebuilding of a life you didn't plan, but now wouldn't trade for anything. In the end, the door Gabe never meant to enter became the door he would have knocked on every time if only he'd known it led to light. Not the kind you flip on with a switch, but the kind you become when you learn to stay. We'd love to know where are you watching from. Drop your location in the comments and let us know how this story made you feel. If this touched your heart, inspired you, or simply gave you a quiet moment of reflection, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories just like this. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Your presence here means more than you know.